Hello everybody, Misbah here, and I'm joined by the incredible Sawsan Jabar. And today we're going to be talking about a subject which I know is very, very close to the hearts of many, many educators right now. And I'm personally love hearing about this subject. I know that it's something that people have a really big desire to want to learn more about, but sometimes it can be a prickly subject to kind of approach, just because there are concepts and things that can be spoken about in this this subject, which may make people uncomfortable at first, but then once you understand it, it's like you get it and you realize that it's all part of making your classroom a better place for learners. So today we're going to be talking about how you can improve equity in the classroom with your students this year. And I'm joined by, like I said, Sawsan, who has been a good friend of Wakelet now for quite some time. Sawsan, do you want to just introduce yourself for the folks at home so they know a little bit more about you?
Sure. So I am coming to you from Illinois in the United States. I know we have an international audience here, which is so exciting. I am a global educator. I've worked in several different countries and in several different states, and this is my 24th year in education. I've done everything from teaching in the classroom to being in charge of 250 plus principals and training them and writing curriculum for the entire Emirate of Abu Dhabi at one point. And so, yeah, I have in the last, I want to say 10 years, since I moved back to the United States from Abu Dhabi, I worked in a district that was a homogenous white district, and they had quickly changing demographics like many districts in the United States today, due to global issues, and just faced head on so much marginalization that it got me to, with the students, seeing it firsthand and then experiencing it myself as a professional there. And it got me really just digging into equity work in a way that I was completing my master's and starting my doctorate. And I felt like I wanted to really just dig in deeper. And at that point, it was a real turning point for me in my own career. And just as a person and a professional, I realized, reflecting on my own history as a student from as early as first grade to my graduate studies, that I had names now for a lot of experiences that felt so uncomfortable to me in my personal life as a Palestinian, as a Muslim, as a female in America growing up in these systems with refugee parents who really couldn't name and really couldn't advocate because school to them was so different than it was for us, that it got me questioning a lot of just things in our districts that weren't working, that never worked for me and weren't working for my own children and weren't working for the kids that I was teaching either. And I realized how liberating it was for me to be able to name those things and understand them better. And really just kind of go back into my life in hindsight and understand those things even at a later age so much better. The first time I presented at a conference after I finished my PhD, which focused on inclusion and belonging of Arab American students in public schools, historically homogenous public schools. And that was a gap because there was no research there on the kids. And so that really kind of unleashed story upon story of experiences that Arab students were having in public schools. I stood up, and it was the first time that I claimed my whole identity in front of a professional setting, and I couldn't stop crying. And that to me was just such a big moment because I realized how much I was subconsciously holding back because I realized it was identities that were not accepted in the mainstream and reasons I was being treated unfairly, but you do it subconsciously because you don't know better. And so that kind of put me on this mission to be able to give kids these words and these opportunities to name these things and self-advocate and kind of change the status quo much earlier, because it shouldn't have happened for me in graduate school. It shouldn't have happened for me in my doctoral studies. Some people never get there because they're not focusing on education, or they don't have the luck of being in a classroom where equity is the focus of the professor, and that kind of just opens up a whole opportunity of questions and doors, so it doesn't happen for them. And so you go through life feeling so uncomfortable with macroaggressions and microaggressions and not being able to name them. So I just felt like my whole life could have been so different had I had these opportunities to have these conversations at a much earlier age. And so I want to say for the last 10 years, my work has been focused on engaging students in equity work, working with them instead of working for them, empowering teachers with the tools to be able to do that work on a higher level, speaking at conferences. I've published chapters in books. I've published a few journals as well. I've just tried as much as possible to really, based on my own experiences and the things that I learned along the way and the power that I see that my students are holding and the way that they're using their new understandings to really change things in their local context and beyond that once they get to college level, it's amazing. And so I hope that we're able to really spread this work all over, because I feel like I always say it's much harder to get people who are adults to really think differently, to change their minds and change their hearts, right? Not impossible, but just a lot harder. Kids are much more open to the conversation, and they're experiencing it, and their identities are being formed right in front of you. And so with that, we have these opportunities to really engage in these conversations and build their capacity for civic engagement at any level, and have them really become, I guess, make the choices for their trajectories, as opposed to us determining that for them, or having systems of oppression determine that for them. And so it's just a really powerful thing. So that's really been my focal point. And I've been trying to do that work on many platforms. So I'm working on several projects with Google, with national boards, writing national equity standards, and just kind of trying to get that work in through multiple platforms, advocating on the state level, creating cohorts to try to advocate on a national level for some of these changes to become not optional for schools to do, but something that all schools are doing because they should be doing it.
And I've seen you speak at a number of different sessions at events, and we've had conversations outside of those sessions as well. And I think that one of the things that kind of impressed me so much about the stuff and the work that you're doing is this, like you said, kind of not reclaiming, but like claiming your identity and the power and the importance of an identity for a learner, for a student. And when I look back at my life, and I'm sure that there's a lot of people who are watching this now, because again, like a lot of what Sawsan will be talking about now is quite focused on the US education system, but there's no reason why it cannot be applied outside. I think it's just a case of taking the time to kind of figure that out and be like, okay, well, I may not be in the US, but my school setting is multicultural, and I can apply the things that I've learned to this. And in the end, you're going to have students that don't necessarily fit into what the most populous demographic is in any particular area. And those students in particular, it's very important to make them feel like they have an identity that's respected and that's acknowledged. And I think that's what stood out the most to me in the work that you've done and the sessions that I've seen you give. That idea of I'm Palestinian, I'm Muslim, I'm a woman, and I'm not only proud of it, but I'm going to explain to you why I'm proud of it. I'm going to explain to you how I've been feeling over the last 10 years, like you said, when my stories and my life and my name and my language and who I am as a person isn't being reflected in the things that you're either teaching or learning. And I think that the methods that you share and the things that you speak about are incredible. I know that we're going to be unpacking a few of them today. The first question which I have to ask you is, this is something, equity in general, I can see that in the last 5 years or so, it's becoming more important than ever. And I think that it's gone mainstream, and that's a really good thing. I don't think it's gone mainstream enough yet, but I think that it's become a standard part of the vocabulary for education now. There are a lot of people speaking about it. Do you think that the professional development and the training that teachers receive from their districts, do you think it's enough? Do you think that there is any? Do you think that it is really preparing teachers to make their classrooms more equitable spaces for their learners? Or do you think it's not caught up yet? Do you think it's out of date, maybe?
So I think that's a really loaded question that's very multi-layered, right? Because just to piggyback off of the last question, even in communities all over the world, right? I've done trainings in countries like Malaysia, South Africa. I've worked very heavily with Dubai and continue to work with them in Abu Dhabi on different things and doing trainings for teachers and schools. And I think just the human nature, right? Kids, adolescents, they're developmentally at an age when they're in middle school and high school, especially, that they just want to fit. And in any country that you go to, there are certain standards, there's layers of, right? There's socioeconomic, there's race, there's gender, there's all of these different things that would kind of connote inequities or cause inequities, regardless of where you are geographically. And as people growing up, we are socialized in those systems to normalize, depending on where you are, what those inequities look like. They become normal. People they can't notice them so that they can name them as inequities and then disrupt them, right? But this is what I teach my kids. We want to notice, name, and then interrupt. And what does that look like, right? So before we can even start to talk about equity work on a school level or on an individual level, right? Because I always talk about how equity work has 3 layers. It's individual, right? Within yourself. It starts introspectively. It's relational because it's your relationship with the people around you in your community, in your classroom, your positionality, their positionality, how you position yourself when you have the option to position yourself. And then it's systemic, right? People tend to focus on the individual, the relational, or the systemic, and not look at all three. And that's a flawed thing because oftentimes people will, when we focus on the individual, the system is still at play in the background and it's not being disrupted. So you're working against kind of the flow of things. When you focus on the systemic, you're focusing on the system. The individuals make the system. So we're not really disrupting it there too, because they're still continuing on like, perpetuating harm on students or perpetuating harm on a political level, wherever the inequities exist, and they're everywhere, right? We're continuing to run. So unless we're focusing on all of these three kind of focuses at the same time, we're missing the mark by a lot. And I think that's what's happening in a lot of schools. So the first thing that has to happen is, I always say, we have to deconstruct so that we can reconstruct our understandings. And that's not happening. So when we're growing up in these socialized systems, even BIPOC folk who are the target of a lot of this marginalization, and I'll talk about the Arab community before I talk about anybody else, many of the kids in my dissertation and their parents could not name their own marginalization. It was easier for them to say, oh, I witnessed this happening to my Black peer or my Latinx peer, and could not name it when it was happening to them because it was too painful or too difficult for them to really name as something. It was always, oh, well, she was just joking, or he didn't really mean it, or, this made me feel uncomfortable, but I don't think it was racism or marginalization. They couldn't name it for what it was. It was just too difficult. And so that to me was like the first red light, because these kids didn't have the tools, just like I didn't have the tools to name it. So I would say, yes, equity work is happening across the board in a lot of different schools. Here in America, I think that we see the pendulum swinging the other way. George Floyd put equity work at the forefront for a lot of people because COVID, we were sitting at home. George Floyd was not the first or the last Black man to be killed by police, in kind of like, in an unfair, like everybody watched that happen. And so because people were glued to their screens, it forced the world to have a conversation they were avoiding from having for a really long time. And I think the international pressure of watching that 8-minute and 22-second video forced America to really have a conversation and to make a change, or at least attempt to make a change. And I think because people didn't really look at the root of the problem, it's another, I always say, we're putting a Band-Aid on a gashing wound and not really addressing the problem from its core. Because in order to address the problem at its core, it has to start from the individual himself or herself. It has to start with us, right? And you have, go ahead, sorry.
I'm so sorry, Sawsan, just to interrupt very, very briefly. And like, one of the things because I know we're about to go somewhere else, and I wanted to kind of hone in on this one thing, because I find it quite interesting. When you mentioned that there are parents that you've spoken to who may choose to either ignore or justify some of the problematic behavior that they've been subjected to. What do you think the motivation is for that? Is it just a lack of understanding? Is it that they really want to fit in? They don't want to rock the boat? Like, why is it that people aren't quick to even call those things out when it's directed at themselves?
I think it's all of that, right? You consider the school to be a system of power. One, for a lot of our parents, especially from marginalized community, that traumatize the parents, right? Or parents that are coming in from different countries, they don't understand, or where there's language barriers, they can't communicate effectively. Or like in the community where I teach, many of the parents trust our school. Like they give us full trust. So there's no questioning. And the voices that are, the voices that are heard are the voices that have historically had the privilege of being heard. And so those are the voices that are being integrated into everything versus the voices of the people at the margins who continue to be silenced, either by themselves because the systems have historically silenced them, or like for the Arab community, we are failed citizens by research, right? Bank says Arabs, Muslims are failed citizens. We have never been accepted, and we are considered perpetual foreigners in the United States by most people. Like, one of the first things I always hear from somebody who looks at me and they don't want to see me there is go back to your country, even though I've been born and raised here, right? But to them, my hijab connotes I have to be a foreigner. And so we're constantly working against those labels of being perpetual foreigners. And so that by itself will hinder and inhibit a comfortable relationship with school teachers, with school administrators. And like we haven't, I hear in a lot of those parents don't want to, they don't care, or, the misconception by schools that parents don't want to be involved or they don't care about education. And so they're not involved. Oftentimes as schools, we're not doing the community work that's part of our responsibility of preparing parents and giving them the tools to be able to engage effectively with their kids' learning, right? Like my parents, they moved to America, they came to America, they were here as their biggest thing was our education was our liberation, right? We are only going to see liberation of Palestinians and Palestinian bodies in the diaspora through education. Education was everything to my parents. Did they know how to engage in schools and really advocate for us? Not at all, right? It wasn't because they didn't care, but they didn't know how. And so I think though there's those kind of misconceptions too about how to engage the work that we're doing to make sure that language is not a barrier, to make sure that parents know how to use, for example, today technology, most report cards, most grades, most communication is through email. How many parents really know how to use those platforms, right? How are we preparing them? Like writing an email can be very intimidating for somebody who A, doesn't know how to use technology, or B, doesn't have the language to write in English. And so those would inhibit, communication in a normal time. Forget when there's contention or an issue of where parents need to advocate for their kids. I know in my case, a lot of times when I would come home and tell my parents stories, they just couldn't understand even. And I felt like that with a lot of the parents that I interviewed for my dissertation. They couldn't understand the pressures of being like in a space where you're constantly trying to be, people are trying to assimilate you, where there's no mirrors for you in curriculum whatsoever. Like you're constantly immersed. And I always think of Adichie, and I know she's controversial now, but when she talks about how growing up, all she read was white stories. And so when she became a writer, the first stories she wrote were with white characters because she couldn't see somebody who looked like her in a text because she's never read as a writer somebody who looked like her in a text. And so she had to train herself. She had to deconstruct her understandings of what kinds of people could make it into a story so that she can create stories that were mirrors to her for herself. And so like that's the kind of things that I'm like thinking about in classrooms with teachers, like really just getting to the core of understanding how somebody's self-concept is absolutely impacted by the mirrors and the windows that we create in classrooms all day long, right? It's not just about like, you hear people throwing around words like, oh, let's be culturally responsive. We'll put a text in there that's a marginalized author from a marginalized background, put it into a classroom, check, we're being culturally responsive, we've done our work. It's performative, right? And that's what's happening in a lot of schools. Like how much of the work is really impacting our students, giving them power back, preparing them. And I always say, if we're preparing students to be academics, right? In America, we have a very capitalistic perspective of what schools should do. We want kids to go to school so that they could secure good jobs and make money. What happens to making sure that once kids graduate from 12th grade, that they actually have the tools to be civically engaged and really have a say in the trajectory of what our country looks like once they're adults in the world, right? It's beyond the capitalistic perspective. And so when we think about really giving, and I always say, if we're not preparing kids before they leave us to engage with any person outside of here, to be able to self-advocate at a college level or in a career, and even if they're going to homogenous school districts, if they're in a community where everybody looks like them, it becomes even more important for us to prepare them for a global community. Because you don't even have to leave your home to engage with global communities today. Technology, like here you are, you're on one part of the earth, I'm on another, and here we are having a conversation. How important is it for us to really prepare kids before they get into these spaces to be able to engage at any level, right? Because technology has really taken away borders and physical space. We're all sharing space in this new platform, and mobility is a lot easier, right? People can move from one place to another so much easier than they did 20 years ago. So it becomes so much more important for us to really build these skills with kids if we claim that the role of K through 12 schools is to prepare kids for college and career. That's a really big part of it. Because in a district like mine, really quickly, we have a primarily Latinx community. And so one of the things that really has become evident is that we have a great culture, but part of the reason we have a great culture is because there's so many kids who look like each other. So that creates a sense of culture for kids. The kids that I interviewed that graduate, who go to different districts they go to universities that are much more diverse, they struggle. They struggle immensely because they haven't had the opportunity to learn how to engage, which is why I modified my curriculum even more to make sure that kids have opportunities of authentic engagement through technology with diverse communities in order to prepare them for those conversations and for understanding that maybe not everywhere else I'm going to go, people are going to be friendly to who I am, as I feel here, because there's so many other people who speak my language and who look like me and who have similar cultures, religion. They share so many different things that there's a sense of safety that's created here, but it has nothing to do with the work that we're doing. It has something to do with the community and what it looks like itself.
Mm-hmm. And I think on that note as well, when you talk about like having spaces that are diverse and that people can communicate with each other on, please, everybody watching this now, contribute to the chat, and if you have any thoughts and ideas that you want to share, any of your own personal experiences when we go through some of the things that we're speaking about, please just share them in the chat. We'd love to see them, and I know the rest of the community would as well. We have an incredibly diverse community from all over the world, and it's always good to hear everybody's opinions. And so yeah, share what your if you agree or disagree or whatever it might be. Please share in the chats. Sawsan, I'm just thinking to myself now that like I'm just imagining that I'm a teacher and I'm crazily overworked and I'm underpaid and I'm not appreciated for my job, and I'm doing my absolute best. I'm just doing my best, and I just want to make sure that my students get a good quality education, okay? What do you say for teachers who may be in that boat and say, listen, I just don't have enough time in the day to get my head around concepts like microaggressions and intersectionality and generational trauma and all this kind of stuff. I simply don't have the time to do that. I don't have the time to do the learning. I don't have the time to implement it into my lesson when I've got 30 screaming kids, adolescents who I need to teach. You're obviously extremely passionate about this subject, and you've come up with ways that you've been able to integrate these learnings and these findings into your lessons. First of all, what advice would you have for teachers who want to make a difference, but that's the kind of boat that they feel like they're in?
So, okay, I think there's so many, again, another layered question, but there's so many. I've been teaching for 24 years. So when I graduated from my teacher's program, the biggest thing that we were learning 24 years ago was don't smile till Christmas. Spend the first 2 weeks, right? Like establishing protocols and procedures in your classroom and make sure that that's what you're focusing on. Obviously, that's the way I was taught. And so that's how I started my education, my career. When I look back at my earlier years, and it wasn't because I was a new teacher, up until I came back from Abu Dhabi, and I look at my profession as a teacher, and I'm like, there's so many things that I did that I wish I could go back and redo differently. I found that I was working so much harder, right? My relationships with my kids have always been great because I started out as a young teacher, so I think I could just relate to a lot of my students. But I think that now doing this work, I realize a few things. I work a lot. I don't want to say a lot less because I work hard, but I feel like work is not what it used to be as far as the lifting is concerned, because now we lift together. I learn alongside my students, and we do this work together. And I think the difference is when you do this work, right? The kids are empowered. The relationships are so much stronger. We start by the first 2 weeks of school. I spend the first 2 weeks of school not teaching content, but really getting to know my kids beyond the surface level, right? We're not doing the, hey, bring 3 things to school that are indicative of who you are. And then they bring their basketball, a picture of their family, and a picture of their friends. And we call, okay, that's our get to know you activity. We're done. Now let's get into curriculum. We spend 2 to 3 weeks just talking about things like intersections of our identity. What is your name? What is your name story? And I share my name story, right? Like it's such an important thing for them to really value their name and understand their name. And for me to know where the name, the heritage of their name comes from. As a parent, I spent so much time like just deciding what my kids' names were and making sure that they were something meaningful to us and that they carried, my last name, for example, is an indication of the lineage of my origin as a Palestinian from Deir Yassin and the freedom fighters of Deir Yassin who have carried through up until my grandfather and survived that war and that kind of that history, right? Like, so there's pride in my last name. And so just like there's pride in my first name and last name and meaning for that, and it alludes to a racial background, an ethnic background, it alludes to all of these different things, kids have the same. So I spend 3 weeks just unpacking, who are you really? Like, what are the intersections of your identity? How do you identify, right? And what is important to you? What are your values? And where do you think those values come from? It's not just like, I love to play basketball, but like, who are you as a person? What is important to you? And why is that important to you? Where does that come from? Because if we they really get at the core of where values come from. We understand that so many things have been passed down to us because we've been immersed in that we don't even question. And when we can get to that understanding, when we get to bigger things like stereotypes and other things that we believe about different groups of people, we've already had an understanding that sometimes we just immerse ourselves and kind of, we take things in like sponges without questioning them, like our values. And so you're establishing kind of understandings that are really integral for later. And when the kids see that a teacher cares enough to really get to know them beyond a surface level, I'm telling you, Misbah, those kids will bend over backwards for you because they know that you love them and you care for them. And so when you're pushing them, they know it's coming from a place of love and understanding. Like kids will walk into my classroom every single day and say, oh, Dr. Jaber, this was the class that we've been waiting for all, this is like, I'll hear, this is the class that we've been waiting for all day because this is a safe space. This is the only space I've ever feel seen. But I also hear, this is the hardest class. It's physics in your class. So the rigor is there, right? I'm pushing kids regardless of what level I'm teaching. I've taught, we're tracked college prep all the way to AP. I've taught all three levels. And at every single level, I'm teaching the same way. I don't believe in tracking. So the same curriculum happens at all levels. And I'm pushing kids, at whatever level they are and scaffolding to help them build individual understandings where they need it. They do things like journal really, really heavily in order for me to like have one-on-one dialogue with them, because these are collective conversations and people are just like adults. Kids are in different places on these journeys. And so creating spaces for them, affinity groups versus non-affinity groups, spaces like journals for them to like really process these conversations, and also making sure that they have a space to process so that they're not harming other students that come from marginalized backgrounds in their conversation as they process and learn. All of that is really important. And these are things I learned along the way. It's not things that I did from the beginning, but I realized that these things were happening and had to put mechanisms into place in order for me to prevent them or help facilitate with kids these conversations. But once these things are happening, I find myself not standing up doing the heavy lifting anymore, but where I'm a facilitator and the conversation's happening from the kids. And I always tell the students, like the biggest thing that we need to do, and I call my students scholar activists, because the questions that we ask is, what do we know? Who am I? How do I view myself? How does the world view me? How do those kind of the answers to those questions impact how I walk through the world, how I see it now, how I interact with other people, which is really important because I think, it's hard I teach in a district where there's a lot of students that come from European backgrounds and they're immigrants. It's a a smaller percentage than our Latinx community, but we have a percentage of European immigrants who come and they are on a lower socioeconomic demographic. So they have to work really hard to have everything that they have. So when we talk about privilege, when we talk about white privilege, these are kids who the response often comes back, I'm not privileged. I had to work for everything that I have, right? My parents worked really hard. They came here with nothing. They continue to work very hard. How can you say that we're privileged? So when we talk about positionality and how you view the world and how other people view you, it becomes a lot easier for them to see their privilege, right? Because it's beyond the socioeconomic. It's more than that. It's the privileges that you have simply by being the skin color that you are and walking through life, whether it's in your career or in different places, the privileges that opens up for you versus somebody who is also lower socioeconomic, is black or is Latinx or is Arab or is Asian or is from a different background, right? And I think those are hard things because it's hard for people who, it's just hard to unteach, and it's hard to see your parents working as hard as they're working, but to think also that there's still privilege there, right? And how layered that is. So I think it opens the door for a lot of those conversations to have them. And once you're there, you're building those chances. And it's not, I always say to teachers, it's not an and or, like I'm not making a choice of teaching the standards that I have to teach, like American schools have standards, right? And I think a lot of schools across the world do, like countries around the world. So we have standards that we have to teach at every level. I'm not choosing to teach equity over my standards. I am learning how to integrate my standards through an equity lens, right? And making, for example, I'm still teaching grammar, but I tell my students, like, how does grammar impact voice is a really big thing for 11th grade English, for example. So I'll tell my students, okay, I want you to think about the period, right? And I want you to think about yourself as a writer and your voice as a writer. Where do you want to place a period to force somebody to sit in your words? Because and we talk about Edgar Allan Poe and how oftentimes in his stories, he didn't include a place or a name of a character because what he wanted you to focus on was the psyche of the character. in the story, the narrator. And so how are you as a writer able to control your reader, what they know, what they're reading, what they're understanding as a storyteller, as a poet, as a creator, as a content creator? And what do you want to share from your own life or your lived experience that you think you need to elevate? Who do you want to elevate it to? And why is this what you choose to share? So these are all, you're teaching them writing, right? You're teaching them rhetoric, you're teaching them persuasion, you're teaching them grammar, you're teaching them how to think about sentence starters, how to enhance their own voice as writers, how to use their voice as a source of power. But what's happening now is that it has personal meaning. And so I have kids that'll come and say, I dreaded English. My kids we're publishing our first poetry anthology, and every student in my class has a poem in that anthology. Every student in my class is a poet. And when I say, let's write our first poem, everybody's like, oh, but I've never written a poet. I'm not a poet. I hate writing poetry. And we hate poetry. But then when we give them the tools to think about the power in poetry as a mode and mechanism of communication, all of a sudden poetry becomes another source of power. It becomes another tool. It becomes another way for me to tell my story and claim. And like you said, it is reclaiming your identity, because the history of marginalized groups, I always say it's the African proverb, right? We'll never hear the story of the lion. When we have the story of the lion and the hunter, we're always hearing the story of the hunter, right? And we never hear the story of the lion. And so this is an opportunity for the lion to be heard, because he is the one that has less power in this dynamic. And so this is their story, and they're reclaiming that. They're taking it back. So instead of leaving it for somebody else to tell and really misrepresent, and even when we have, like I always say, one of the biggest equity errors that teachers make is when they assume that a book, and I'll say this as an Arab again, The Kite Runner, right, is being taught across America as a culturally responsive text for Arab and Muslim kids. Khalid Hosseini is not an Arab, right? It's a misunderstanding of Arab identities. And he's an extremist Muslim. So that doesn't represent Islam. It's not a mirror for Arab students, and it's not a mirror for most Muslim students. And so we're as teachers making choices for kids about what a mirror of them should look like. And by doing so, we are perpetuating harm by immersing those students in stereotypes. And by doing so, we're harming Arab and Muslim students, but we're also harming other students, because that becomes the only window they have, for most of them, into Arab and Muslim identities. And what happens there is that we're kind of feeding into this culture of fear that exists around those identities, of criminalization that exists around Black and brown identities, right? And when we have an elevation of fear, what happens is rationality diminishes. And people are no longer making decisions and reacting to each other with rationale. They're acting from a place of fear. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of our world today. And so I always talk to my students about that dynamic, and we talk about, like, how do we get rid of that fear? It's by education and understanding, right? And what better platform is there for us to use than schools to really start to understand each other? That's why they're scholar activists, because first we have to know, and then the question becomes, what do we do with what we know? And so we can't learn without using all of our education as a conduit to action. And so that's when my students then use the last third of the year to really create TED Talks, write poetry, write their own stories. They create videos, PSAs, podcast series, whatever they can. They have the freedom to create with whatever platform they want, and speak to an authentic audience of their choice, kind of using rhetoric, writing, all of these different tools as an English classroom to really push this forward. And I've done these trainings for teachers from science backgrounds, from math backgrounds, regardless of what content area. I know it lives more comfortably in humanities classes, but the reality is all of those things we talk about in education, social emotional learning, right? If a child is being harmed in a classroom every single day, we are not meeting their social emotional needs. You can't start, there's a direct connection between equity and social emotional learning. And post-COVID, social emotional learning has got to be at, like, the highest levels of everything. We know that there are mental health issues in every community, especially post-COVID, that have come to the forefront. So how can you not, right? Differentiation. How can you meet the needs of kids if you don't know who they are and differentiate for them? You can't, right? So when we talk about social emotional learning, we talk about differentiation, we talk about holism. How can we really think that we're viewing students and meeting their needs from a holistic perspective if we don't really understand or know who those kids are, right? So if we want to look at any of the buzzwords that have come out in the last 10 years in education, cultural responsiveness, all of these different things, when we talk about equity, equity is the foundation to every single one of those things and the thread that connects them all together. And so here in America, we have bills that are being passed that are keeping people from doing equity work in states on a national and state level. And there's a really big push to kind of weaponize the work and censor it, right? And I always say a rose by any other name smells just as sweet, right? The quote from Juliet, from Romeo and Juliet, because at the end of the day, equity work is understanding that our kids come in with funds of learning that we need to really maximize and use, that difference and diversity in countries like America and the UK are what make our countries beautiful and great and really are expanding. My best resource in every classroom are my kids. You know, when they come in, when they write poetry, I tell them, if you speak another language, please integrate your mother tongue into your work. You are creating for yourself, right? And don't translate for us, because it's not about me as the receiver of the information. When you're writing to create for yourself. This is your voice. And whatever your voice is, authentically, I need you to use that voice in this classroom. Don't write for me. You're writing for yourself. And I think that just takes out a whole bunch of pressure. You know, when they talk about, well, Dr. Jaber, like, how long does it have to be? How long do you want it to be? What format should I use? Well, what format do you want to use? Like, this is your piece. They don't know what to do with that agency because schools have stripped them from agency at very young ages. And so giving them the agency, the choice, the ability to be content creators instead of content consumers, giving them the opportunity to and the tools to be able to create whatever they want for an audience that they want, and then giving them the conduit to see the return of people kind of engaging with the work that they've created, it makes them want to continue. So my students have co-presented with me in conferences for the last 2 or 3 years. They share their work on public platforms like Wakelet. Wakelet has given us an opportunity to really kind of curate all of our work and blog and do different things so that we have live audiences that are responding to their work all the time in real time. And I think when they see, and there's something so much more powerful about kids speaking. Like, I can speak in a conference for 40 minutes. The last 20 minutes when my kids speak is so much more powerful than the 40 minutes that I've spoken. There's power there, right? And when they
feels like you have a very cooperative relationship with your students. It's less about, you know, I'm the teacher, this is what's happening today, go. It's more like you're working with them. Like you said, I love that thing that you said, where you said that your students are your greatest resource in your classroom. You know, that they have personalities and interests and things about themselves and information that makes the lesson more rich, that makes the classroom a better environment, and it feels like you're doing a lot of work to draw that out. But I love that feeling that it's like a cooperative kind of lesson, like it's a cooperative relationship that you have as opposed to just teacher student. That's where it ends. I'm sorry I cut in front of you there.
No. And that's really such a big part of it. I think that as a teacher teaching this way, you have to be more vulnerable and more flexible. My curriculum never looks the same 2 years in a row because I always say we read the world, right? So whatever's happening in our world outside, that's also a big resource. And when I do trainings for teachers, one of the things that I do is I take a series of pictures that are happening in the world today. And I say, like, this is the reality of our kids today. This is what they're walking in carrying. So how can I be an effective teacher if I'm not taking that into consideration? Where are they unpacking, especially with technology? Like, technology is a double-edged sword. It's a beautiful tool, but it's a weapon at the same time. Our kids are immersed in global, tragedy. They are, and pressures to be something that they're not, and all of these different things that they have to internally process, which is in turn leading very heavily to these mental health issues because nobody is talking to the kids about it. So this is a space where let's process this together. Sometimes I'll have a lesson planned and the kids will come in. When Roe versus Wade was overturned, my students came in and said, Dr. Jaber, can we please talk about this, right? And a big part of it too is whenever they're asked to do something, I also have to do it. I have to model that with them. So when they write, I write. When they share, I share. And I think that also helps them to see that I'm not directing the work, but I'm a co-conspirator and an ally. If we're going to advocate for something, I'm going to be at the front lines advocating with them. And that is something that's super important because it builds that trust in that relationship where they see that I'm not putting them at the forefront and standing behind them, but I am at the forefront with them on the field, rolling up my sleeves. What matters to them matters to me too. What matters to me then becomes a matter of interest to them as well. It's reciprocal.
Yeah. One of the most beautiful things that I really saw on Wakelet ever really was when teachers began using the platform as a way to make introductions to each other between the students and themselves. So they would create a Meet the Teacher collection. And in that collection, it wouldn't just be, like you said, it wouldn't be surface level things. It wouldn't just be, you know, I'm Mr. Gedal, I like basketball and pizza, and here's my favorite song. It was a little bit deeper than that. It's, this is my family, this is my heritage, these are the things that I like, these are the things that I don't like, these are the, this is the social activism things that I'm interested in, whatever it might be, just to really flesh out who you are as a personality. And the amount of teachers that that did this and then set a task for their students to basically do the same and create a collection on Wakelet and really go into those things, you know, like they have free reign to design the collection however they want, and like you said, do it in any language that they might want, and add videos of themselves talking, and in exchanging those Wakelet collections with their fellow students, it made the classroom feel like a more communal space, like a community, and you know, it helps you empathize, and like you said, it all begins with empathy. So that was one of the you know, a really nice way of doing that, of taking it away from that superficial skin deep type thing and making it more about this is who I am, you know, this is the language that I speak, this is the religion I follow. Hey, look, this is me at the mosque, you know, and then this is me at the synagogue, this is me at the church, whatever it might be. And it just allows for those conversations to happen that would not have happened had it not been for that opportunity for them to share that. Because not every student's going to get in a situation where they can share who they are and what their identity means to them and where their name is from and that kind of thing. So I think that what you're describing is a classroom that is centered around this idea of community, this idea of, like you said, we are all in this together. You need the students as much as the students need you, and they must feel very empowered by that. And I know that, you know, when we were at NCTE, some of your former students were giving presentations, and you know, just the emotional kind of strength that they had, and the thanks that they were giving you as their former teacher for kind of empowering them to get to the point where they're giving, you know, a speech in front of hundreds of people was so incredible to see. So clearly your methods must be working. I suppose that kind of leads on to my next question, right? Which is, you've described a few really good ways that teachers can take steps. And I think that what you're working on, what I've gathered from this is that if you just do the work, even for like a week or two, to set that foundation, to set that environment where students feel more comfortable and more empowered, the rest just kind of naturally follows, because once students feel empowered to share their identities, then that increases empathy, it does all those things. So doing those things is great. How do you, as a teacher though, like, how do you make it tangible? Like, let's say, can you make it tangible? Can you say that because of X, Y, and Z, I have a more equitable classroom? Can you add data to it? Is there some way, for example, to say, I'm performing well at this, like I've done the work and now my classroom is more equitable? Or is it a little bit more subjective, and is it more of a feeling? I don't know if you'll be able to help answer that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's measurements for equity, right? I feel like if there were, then we could call out all of the performative equity that's happening in schools across the country in the name of equity, and say that this is not really equity happening, right? Because equity right now in most spaces sits in the philosophical, and it's up to people to turn it into something actionable and tangible. So I don't know if we have ways of measuring it. For me personally, I think I obviously, as somebody who has, like, this work was stemmed through research for my doctoral studies. And so I always lean on research for a lot of it. But then one of the things that I'm very intentional about is how do we turn research into action? And so I think there are some obvious things, like we're siloed as communities across the world, right? People tend to feel more comfortable around other people who look like them. And so what that creates is a dehumanization of the other, the othering of everybody else, right? And so I think, like, it feels like common sense to me that one of the biggest things that we just need to do is humanize each other, right? And research shows that collaborative learning is the best medicine to inequity or misunderstanding, or like the best multicultural education is just by engaging with people in a very human way. And so I'm a person who I can share story upon story of a student walking into my classroom and saying, Dr. Jaber, my father says you're a terrorist. And I'm like, okay, let's talk about that, right? Let's talk about where we think that comes from. this is in a district where they've never interacted with anybody who looked like me before, right? And the only story that they had was the one that they were watching on television. And so my hijab automatically meant that to this family. And so we had a conversation for 2 days to unpack where that came from. We came to the conclusion that we fear what we don't understand. And so the key to really kind of understanding each other better is learning. So I said, okay, ask me whatever you want to know. And so I spent 2 days answering questions. And then I said, go back and tell your father. I got a call from dad 2 days later apologizing, because he said, we never interacted with anybody who looked like you, and I apologize. We're very grateful for the conversation and for passing that information forward. I've had teachers come to me and say, how do you feel after what your people did in France, referencing an ISIS bombing, because my hijab to them symbolized ISIS. These are educators who teach kids who look like me, right? So in educational spaces, there's so much misunderstanding because they are people who have been socialized by the same systems, the same white curriculum, right, that many of us grew up learning. And so the only way to really disrupt that is, again, by deconstructing so that we can construct new understandings. And so I think the siloing, like for me, seeing kids interact with each other, seeing their interest in learning about like different people, watching them engage in the work. Like you said, I have students that I taught who are now teachers because they wanted to do the same work and now are doing similar work with their own students. That is an impact. That's impact, right? Kids who graduate from your class in May, but then are communicating with you June, July, and August with work that they're doing on their own. My students from last year have done teach-ins. My students have written poetry, and they've spoken like in different spaces with other kids, with adults. They've talked to me about walking into family spaces of 20, 30 family members and having conversations about things like Thanksgiving, about settler colonialism, about all of these big topics that so many adults that I know that can't have those conversations. So that to me is all qualitative data that this is working. In the class, I have journals. The journals to me are an indication of ways for me to kind of understand where kids are thinking and if they're building their capacity and how they're responding to the work that we're doing in class, what's working and what's not. And I think what happens too is when you create these safe spaces, I don't call them safe spaces because they're not safe because everybody's uncomfortable, because this work is uncomfortable. They're brave spaces, right? When you're creating these brave spaces where kids are walking into it knowing that they're going to be uncomfortable, but that's all. I tell my students at the beginning of the year, if it's not going to make you better out there, we're not doing it in here. Everything that we do is with the intent that we are building ourselves as human beings to be able to face the world and interact with the world more effectively and more impactfully as people. And if I am, as a citizen of this country, if I have the privilege of, like in our district, we have a beautiful district with a beautiful community and it's very safe. We never have to worry about shootings. We never have to worry about a lot of the things that are existing in other communities in the United States. We have the financial ability to really support our students in any way that they need it. Those are all privileges that we talk about. So when we look at, for example, schools and districts where they don't have these privileges and they are districts that are primarily minoritized majorities, what is our job when we are able to notice name? What is our job in interrupting for those kids, right? Because if you're an equity advocate, you're an equity advocate not just when it impacts you, you're an equity advocate whenever inequity exists, and inequities are all over us, all around us. And so we have to notice, name, and interrupt and be advocates and allies for any group regardless. And I always try to focus too on being somebody that, as an educator in spaces where there's not a lot of kids who look like me, even though there's really privileges on both sides, working with kids who look like you, it's important for them to see a mirror who looks like them. But working with kids who don't look like me, because there's not a lot of Arabs and Muslims in our profession. And if there are, there's not a lot of hijabis either. And in conferences where I'm speaking, I'm often the only hijabi speaking in a lot of these conferences. So that representation for educators and for students becomes super important, because just by being present, even if I'm not talking about a lot of those issues, we're humanizing each other. Right. And so I think that qualitative data is constant in the classroom. You're seeing it based on students' interactions. I had a student who resisted the conversations all year. And then I do a conference for students called the Day of Action, where I bring in speakers from different backgrounds who focus on highlighting inequities, systemic inequities in different professions. So we talk about urban planning, finance, the school to prison pipeline, education, all of these different fields. And these are professionals who have kind of noticed, named, and interrupted within their professions. And the purpose of the day is to show students that activism has so many different faces. It's not just political advocacy, but you can be an activist by reclaiming your own narrative. You can be an activist by really lobbying for, for example, we talked about in our own community. There's certain parts of the community that don't have sidewalks, so that it's intentionally trying to keep people from one side of the community from getting to the other side. And so that's an inequity, right? Like we talk about credit scores and how BIPOC credit scores are essentially lower from the very beginning. And that kind of spikes interest rates on mortgages and credit cards. And how is that an inequity? All of these different things. And then how can you, as somebody who's working in these fields, kind of lobby and work to really dismantle some of those systems? And so here's a student who's been like against the whole conversation and really pushing back. And he was an informal leader in my classroom. A lot of the kids looked up to him. After the day of action, he wrote in his journal one line and he said, "I get it now." That is data that this conversation is working, because for the rest of that year, that student became a very vocal advocate. And as an informal leader in the building, so many students were ready to listen to him when they weren't ready to listen to me. So the data happens in front of you. It's just like the kids. When they see people reacting to the things that they're saying, it makes them want to do more because they can see the return, the immediate return. Right. In a classroom, the return is absolutely immediate, and you can see it. And so that work, it may take time for some kids, just like adults. You know, we're at different places, and depending on your background and the values that you grew up with in the home, the parents kind of thinking and all that other stuff, and the communities, that how diverse your friend circles are, all those different things, it may take you longer to get there. But my experience would say, after doing this for a really long time, that most of our kids get there. And I always say, the next president could be sitting in my classroom. The next Supreme Court judge could be sitting in my classroom. The next teacher that has impact to teach hundreds of kids year after year could be sitting in my classroom. So this is our long-term investment as a country. And if we think about the fact that we are one of the only countries in the world right now that's dealing with things like school shootings, and many of our school shooters are primarily white young men from affluent backgrounds, when we talk about inclusion work, it includes everybody, right? Just like Black scholarship and Black advocacy. Historically, Black advocacy movements like the Black Panther movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, they're advocating for the Black community. But what they're advocating for are things that benefit every single community, even though they're the most marginalized. And when we're talking about inclusion work and really doing the work as schools and systems to include and help kids belong, those are things that we all have a personal invested interest in, because it makes every kid feel seen and belong. You're not focusing on one group of students while you're kind of overlooking another group. This is about empowering every child in your classroom to really be a community. And in America, I will say, and I know in a lot of other places, that work is like when I send my kids to school in the morning and we get a notification that there's a lockdown because of a potential threat. As a parent, I have a vested interest. As somebody who works in a school building, as an employee in a school building all day long, I have a vested interest. If you're going to a marathon, a movie theater, a club, in any public space where shootings are happening now, and so many of them are racially motivated shootings, we have a large interest as a country, as a community, as a world to do this work, because that's the only way these problems will start to dissipate and go away.
I think that what I've gathered from that is that, like, you're getting your students to feel empowered enough to be able to make changes, not only within the way that they think, but also within the way that their wider communities think. Like you mentioned, you know, that school leader, an informal school leader, having, you know, profound level of influence over their peers and their classmates, and then also like parents and that as well, you know. But what about the actual teachers themselves? Because I'm sure that there are teachers who are watching this now that may not feel very empowered within their school districts. They may be in school districts that are predominantly one particular race, whether that's around the world. They may not be that race, and they may not already feel empowered. So how do you? I mean, this will be our last question, I think. But how do you feel that a teacher who does not feel empowered to do the work that you're doing, because they may be up against the curriculum, they may be up against certain figures in their district, they may be up against certain I don't know, whatever it might be, how can they come to terms with that? And how, like what was the breakthrough for you, where you were like, you know, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to teach from now on, and this, you know, where did you get that confidence from, I suppose?
Well, I think for me personally, it comes from the fact that I had a realization of how much it inhibited my growth as a person, not being in context like that once I got to graduate school. And how—
So it's about personal growth for you.
For me, and my own lived experience. I think my own lived experience is what got me to see the value in the work and to really consider and think about, and then watching my kids kind of go through more aggressive marginalization as time progressed. Like my 25-year-old and my 15-year-old, 16-year-old now are just the world of difference in their experiences in school. My youngest child had a lot more difficulty claiming her identity in school spaces, even though there were more kids who looked like her, because of the pushback against who she was. And so watching the aggression kind of grow and the pushback against Arab and Muslim identities grow made me realize the importance of that. And I've worked in districts where district administrators don't want to rock the boat because the majority of the community doesn't want this work to happen, right? They don't have a vested interest in it. And the question I always say to teachers is, at the end of the day, you have a locus of control as an educator in a classroom, right? You are not the system leader. And so I think there's a few things that I would recommend for teachers. No matter what kind of a district you're in, make sure you have a PLN, right? A professional learning network or community where you have other like-minded individuals that you can push back on, because this work is difficult. Even for a teacher, I've been doing it for a long time. There are some days where I am feeling so exhausted by the conversation or re-traumatized by the conversation. It's not easy to have these conversations in a classroom, to hear experiences that kids have had with police brutality, with marginalization, with just the different issues that kids are working through and naming. When these conversations start to happen, they're unleashing a lot of that stuff and you're taking it in. I teach 120 kids every single year. So if 20 of my kids are sharing, I am immersed in these horrible stories oftentimes of things that kids have experienced firsthand, parents being pulled over and brutalized by police officers, the fear that the child had sitting in the car at that time, like all of these different stories. That's heavy. It's heavy stuff all day long. And so I lean very heavily on my professional learning network to sometimes just vent, to process, to ask questions, to get advice. So professional learning network is I have like-minded people in my building. I have a learning network outside of my building. My OVA community, Our Voice Alliance, is a beautiful community that I kind of lean into as well. That's a national community of educators that are all doing equity work. And there are people that I will always, like, if I have a question or I'm not sure how to deal with a situation, I will throw it at my PLNs and kind of see what people have to give back to me. And that feeds me personally, because you can't fill from an empty cup, right? The thing that I would say to teachers who are in systems that push back is, within your locus of control, you have the power in your classroom for the most part. You don't have to be talking about things like marginalization and inequity if your system doesn't allow for that, right? I know that there's some districts, especially now in the United States and in certain states, where you can't even say those things. And so seeing your students, giving them space to reclaim their voices, right? Giving them space to be content creators, giving them their space. I always say, you don't have to get a student's life story approved by a board of education like you do a novel, right? A diverse novel. So give space for your kids to create accurate mirrors of themselves. And by doing so, you are by default creating windows for other students to learn about each other. And what we're also learning is that people are not a monolith, right? Even when we're talking about, like, for example, if I'm teaching in a primarily minoritized majority community or a community of what kids who look like the same, even by doing this work, you're getting kids to realize that we're not all the same person, and that our values are determined by our lived experiences, and our lived experiences differ. And so when we can start to value each other's lived experiences, we can start to empathize with and understand each other's values in ways that we might not have before. And once I can apply that to one group of people, then I can start to apply that to everybody else in my life. And by default, we are dismantling the systems that other and create fear, about people who look different than you, or even people who look the same from you, even within communities. Like, I find that certain minoritized communities even value each other based on what village they're from, or how dark your skin is versus how light your skin is, right? So even internally within communities, there's also oppression and marginalization within these internal communities that we need to work through sometimes in order for us to, like, even understandings of what beauty is. Anti-Blackness is in every single community, right? That's what I've noticed. It's universal. And so, like, working through internal kind of understandings of anti-Blackness ultimately lead us to understand where that comes from, and the criminalization of Blackness and the idea that Black is bad, right? We can work through that within the community without having to bring in all of these other conversations, simply by giving students the space to honor who they are, bring their language in, bring their lived experiences. No one's going to censor a child's lived experience if the space is created for them to be able to tell their story. And that's not stuff we need to get approval for, right? If it comes from the kids, nobody's going to fight it. If it comes from you, there's going to sometimes be a fight. So how can you as a teacher really create spaces where students feel comfortable to use their voice, to tell their stories and be empowered in order for them to just really own their identities? And by doing so, the power of that space is great. So let's start there, right? I teach 120 kids. If I can give students that space every single year, what's the impact that I have there? right? I have students in a district that I taught that was very, very anti this work for 4 years, and those kids are just as empowered. They might not have the terminology and to be able to have the conversations at the level that my kids in the district that I'm working in now have, but they're able to identify and at least be proud of who they are and own their identities. And that's a really big first step.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sawsan. Honestly, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come and speak to us in the community about the things that you've spoken about. I think from my side, this is just the beginning. I'd obviously love to have you join us again, because I know that there's so much more that you can talk about. I know that you've got a lot of resources as well that you'd like to share, so we will get those to the all of the attendees, all of you who are watching today. And I hope that everybody watching has been inspired. I know that I have. I think just listening to you speak and hearing how passionate you are and how confident you are and how you're owning what you're doing in such a beautiful way, and it has a profound effect. And I've seen that in real life, like I've seen it in person, how your former students have responded to the way that you've taught them and who they are now, the people that they are now. It's incredible. And I know that myself, I'm so eager to learn more about this. I'm eager to learn how we can incorporate this not only within our community, but also within our team, the Wakelet team as well, because it's not just student stuff. It's not just, stuff that kids need to do. Like one of the things you've demonstrated through all this is that everybody needs to do the work. Everybody needs to figure this stuff out. And some people may be a little bit closer than others, but it doesn't matter. If we do figure it out, then things are just objectively going to get better. So I really do appreciate it. Thank you to everybody as well who's joined us today. I know that it's very, very busy at the moment for educators all over the world, but I think that taking the time out to discuss and think about and hear about the equity conversation, especially in this context, is super, super important. And Sawsan, thank you for continuing your advocacy and continuing the shining a light on a subject which I think is so important. I really, really appreciate it. I really do, and I hope that you'll come back and talk to me again about this.
Oh my God, it was my honor to be here and share this work. Like you said, this is my life. I think I'm living and breathing this work all day long, because I feel like, again, like my life trajectory would have been so different had these conversations have happened in my adolescent years. I think I would have been just a completely different person. And so, yes, there's power here. It's hard work, but it's really worth it. I think the transformative power of equity work in classrooms, there's not a single teacher that I've ever met who doesn't want to have impact on kids. That's why we go into the profession, because like you said, it's hard work, very, very underappreciated in a lot of spaces, underpaid in most countries. There's not a lot of appreciation to what teachers do. But when you see students who really are appreciative of the impact that you have on them, and it's like, I can't tell you how many students' weddings I've attended, how many of their children I've met. It's really a testament to the work that you're doing and the impact that you've had on individual lives. And that's what we all live for. Every teacher does. And so this is definitely the place. I'm going to ask everybody who's listening today to follow on SJ Educate on Twitter, because you'll see a lot of my student work there. And the great things that we've used platforms like Wakelet also to really communicate to a larger community the work that we're doing in our classroom. And my curriculum never looks the same 2 years in a row. And so as we evolve our conversation, as I continue to grow as a learner in this educational space from my students and from other platforms, a lot of those learning opportunities and things that we modify and change are emerging on Twitter. So follow us if you want to kind of join us on this journey. And if there's any resources or anything that people want to continue the conversation after this platform, you can always reach out. I'm happy to really kind of pay it forward and have this work spread, because I do believe that our long-term investment as nations and as communities is our kids, right? Because it's like what I always tell my kids: we're going to grow old, you're going to take over. And the question that I ask teachers when I do teacher trainings is, what kind of kids do you want to take over? What kind of people do you want to take over your world, right? And that's something that this is the investment, our long-term return. This is the work that teachers are doing. Right? This is a legacy that a teacher leaves behind. It's the kids that you're putting out into the world that are leaving your space, and how they kind of interact with the world once they've left your space, because we're the ones that are shaping them. And so that's a really big question. When we think of it that way, then this becomes very personal, and there's a vested interest in doing this work and doing it well.
Thank you so much, Sawsan. I appreciate it. I know that everybody in the chat appreciates it too. I cannot wait to have another conversation with you, and I think that you've definitely opened some minds today, including mine, and I know that the community will be anxious to hear from you again. Thank you everybody once again for joining us. We appreciate it. Just see the messages in the chat to find out how you can gather more resources more resources on the subject that we've discussed today, along with your certificate as well. And please keep an eye out for more webinars and sessions and podcasts which are going to be headed your way this year. We've not stopped. We will continue putting out this content and talking about the things that you as teachers want to hear. So we really appreciate every single one of you for joining us today. And thank you so much, Sawsan. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.